My husband told me he was flying to Chicago for a crucial conference. He kissed me on the cheek at 6 in the morning. He wheeled his carry-on to the door. He said, "Don't wait up," with the ease of a man who has told that particular lie so many times it had stopped feeling like one. What he forgot, in his hurry, was the AirPods case on the kitchen counter. 2 hours later, when I opened the Find My app, not out of suspicion, just habit, just the reflex of someone who has learned to keep track of things, his AirPods were not at O'Hare Airport. They were not at a Marriott conference center in the Loop. They were not anywhere near Chicago. They were pinging at Mercy General Hospital, maternity ward, 3rd floor. I didn't cry. I didn't call him screaming. I didn't throw anything or spiral or sit on the kitchen floor. I called his boss. I called his mother. And then I called my lawyer. This is how I dismantled his double life in exactly 24 hours. His name was Daniel, is Daniel. He doesn't stop existing just because I stopped building my life around him. Daniel was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately began calculating its hierarchy. Not consciously, or maybe it was, I was never entirely sure. He had the particular charm of someone who has learned that charm is a tool, who deploys it with the precision of a craftsman and the ethics of a contractor who knows which inspections to skip. He was handsome in a forgettable way, successful in a measurable way, and he had spent 5 years of our marriage being just attentive enough that I never accumulated enough evidence to name what I was feeling. Unease, that's the word. The low, persistent hum of a woman who has learned to stop trusting her own instincts because the man she married is very, very good at making her feel irrational for having them. We had been married 5 years, no children. Daniel said he wasn't ready, and I, being the accommodating and reasonable and thoroughly gaslit woman I was, had believed him. We had a shared life, a house with a good mortgage, joint accounts with healthy balances, and a social profile that looked, from the outside, like a success. Documents, though. Documents tell the truth even when people don't, and I had always been a woman who read the documents. If you have ever been manipulated by someone who thought you were too comfortable, too trusting, too in love to see the architecture of their lies, hit subscribe right now. We are building a community here of people who don't just survive betrayal, we weaponize it, quietly, legally, devastatingly. Now, let me take you back to that Tuesday morning. The AirPods case was on the counter beside the fruit bowl. It shouldn't have been there. Daniel was obsessive about his things, the kind of man who treated his belongings like an extension of his personal brand, which meant everything had its place, and its place was always with him. Forgetting the case was the first crack in the architecture. I picked it up. I turned it over in my hand. I told myself I was going to put it somewhere safe for when he got home. And then, because I was already holding my phone, because it took 3 taps, because some part of me that I had been ignoring for months simply decided that Tuesday was the day, I opened Find My. The map loaded. The pin dropped. Mercy General Hospital, 2.4 miles away. I stood at my kitchen counter for 45 seconds. I know it was 45 seconds because I watched the clock above the stove. I have thought about those 45 seconds many times since, about what was happening inside me during them, the processing, the recalibrating, the specific quiet implosion of 5 years of marriage condensed into a GPS coordinate. Then I picked up my keys. The drive to Mercy General takes 11 minutes on a Tuesday morning. I remember the radio was on, and I remember turning it off. I don't remember anything else about the drive. My brain had reallocated its resources. The hospital smelled the way hospitals always smell, that specific combination of antiseptic and recycled air and something floral underneath it that is trying too hard to compensate. I walked to the elevator. I pressed 3. I walked the hall. His lie was a house of cards, and I was the hurricane. But hurricanes don't announce themselves. They simply arrive. The maternity ward corridor was quiet in the way of places where something enormous is happening behind every closed door. I walked slowly. I read the room numbers, and then I stopped at a window. The window was small. The room was warm. I could tell by the quality of light, the way the occupants were dressed, the particular stillness of a space that has been arranged around comfort. There was a woman in the bed, young, dark-haired, enormously pregnant, the kind of late-term fullness that makes the whole body look like an announcement. And there was Daniel, my husband, sitting in the chair beside her bed with his hand over hers, kissing her forehead with the specific tenderness he had at some point in the past 5 years stopped directing at me. I raised my phone. I took 3 photographs, sharp, clear, correctly exposed, the timestamp visible in the metadata, his face in profile, the hospital room number visible on the wall behind him. I lowered my phone. I turned around. I walked back down the corridor, into the elevator, through the lobby, and out into the parking lot. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not feel in that moment what you might expect. What I felt was the opposite of chaos. I felt the particular crystalline calm of a woman who has just been given, completely unbidden, exactly what she needs. Clarity. I had 24 hours. I drove home. The first call was to Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor is a family law attorney who was recommended to me by a colleague 3 years ago, a recommendation I had filed in the back of my mind with the vague, uncomfortable awareness that someday I might need it. Eleanor does not traffic in emotion. She traffics in documentation, precedent, and the specific legal architecture of making sure that when a marriage ends, it ends on the terms that are fair, and when the other party has been conducting a fraud, fair becomes a very interesting word. I told her everything: the AirPods, the hospital, the photographs, the timestamps. She was quiet for 6 seconds. Then she said, "Don't move any money yet. I'll tell you when and exactly how much. Don't confront him. Don't change your behavior. And send me those photographs right now." I sent the photographs. Then I waited for Eleanor to tell me what to move. While I waited, I opened my laptop and I did what the internet makes available to anyone with 45 minutes, a name and a reason. I found her. Her name was Cassidy. She was 26 years old. She worked in marketing. She had a public Instagram with a private pregnancy highlight reel that she hadn't made private quite early enough, and the timeline visible in those photographs aligned with a precision that told me this had not been a brief lapse of judgment. This had been a parallel life, a construction, a second architecture built on the foundation of the first without the first one's knowledge or consent. 12 weeks after Daniel and I had celebrated our 4th anniversary at a restaurant he chose and a toast he gave, she had announced her pregnancy on Instagram with a photograph of a positive test and a caption that read, "Best surprise of my life." I screenshotted everything. Eleanor called back at 11:40 a.m. She gave me a number and a process. I legally transferred my half of our joint accounts to an account in my name alone, a movement that was entirely within my rights, documented to the cent, and which left Daniel's half entirely untouched. I was not stealing, I was simply ensuring that what was mine was protected before the process began. Eleanor filed the initial divorce petition electronically at 12:15 p.m. At 1 p.m., I went to the garage. Daniel owned 6 custom suits, each one fitted, each one part of the performance of being a man who had arrived somewhere. He owned a set of golf clubs so expensive he had mentioned the price unprompted at dinner parties 3 times in the 2 years since he'd bought them. He owned a collection of dress watches he kept in a mahogany box on his side of the closet. I found 3 large black trash bags. I packed the suits first, methodically, efficiently, without malice and without particular care. I packed the golf clubs. I left the watches. Eleanor had advised me that certain items might be contested, and I had no interest in touching anything that might complicate the clarity of what I was building. I carried the bags to the garage. I left them beside the recycling bins, not because I wanted to humiliate him, because his things being in the garage was simply the most accurate representation of where he now stood in the geography of my life. Then I sat down, made a cup of tea, and I prepared for Tuesday morning. The baby arrived at 4:17 in the morning. I know this because Cassidy's Instagram, which had by then been set to private, but which a mutual contact, an old colleague of Daniel's who had, upon receiving a carefully worded message from me, decided that transparency served him better than loyalty to a man who wasn't worth it, shared with me as it happened. A girl. I had time to make coffee, drive to the hospital, and park. I sat in the parking lot until 8:50 a.m. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Richard Holt, Daniel's boss, a man who believed, as of Monday morning, that Daniel was in Chicago meeting with the Renner Group, a meeting that Richard had personally signed off on, that had been on the books for 6 weeks, that had been described to Richard as a make-or-break conversation for a deal worth significant commission. I told Richard that Daniel was not in Chicago. I told him exactly where he was, and I told him that I had photographs. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The second call was to Patricia Whitmore, Daniel's mother, a woman who had welcomed me into this family with genuine warmth, and who had said to me at our wedding that she hoped Daniel knew how lucky he was. I told Patricia that her son had a daughter he had never mentioned. She was on the road in 15 minutes. Daniel was in the maternity ward waiting room at 9:15 in the morning, drinking coffee from a paper cup and wearing the expression of a man who believes he is the protagonist of every room he enters. He didn't see me come in. He saw his mother first. I watched the color leave his face in stages, not all at once, not a dramatic pallor, but a gradual draining, like something structural beneath the surface had failed. He looked from his mother to me. He started to stand. He opened his mouth. He didn't speak, because then he saw Richard, and his mouth simply closed. I had the divorce papers in a manila envelope under my arm. Eleanor had prepared them. A process server had signed off on proper procedure. What I was doing was entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely deliberate. I walked to Daniel. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I stood in front of my husband in a hospital waiting room, with his mother weeping quietly near the window, and his boss standing 10 feet away with an expression carved from granite, and I held out the envelope. I said, "You've been served." 3 words, 11 letters, the complete and total architecture of everything I needed to say. He took the envelope. He had to. His hands were shaking. Mine were not. I looked at him for one more moment, not with hatred, not with grief, with the cool, appraising gaze of a woman who has finished assessing a situation and found it thoroughly resolved. Then I turned around. I walked out. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe heavy. I just left. The fallout was not dramatic. That's the part people don't expect. There was no screaming match, no viral confrontation, no single cinematic moment of reckoning. There was simply consequence. Richard terminated Daniel's employment within 48 hours. Not emotionally. Richard is not an emotional man. He terminated it because Daniel had fabricated a business trip, abandoned a 6-figure client meeting, and lied to his employer about his whereabouts for the better part of a year, during which he was also, it turned out, conducting a financial relationship with his mistress that had occasionally intersected with company resources in ways that Richard's HR team was now very interested in examining. Documents tell the truth even when people don't. Cassidy, and I hold no particular anger for Cassidy, who had been told a version of Daniel just as incomplete as the version I had been told, discovered in the week following the birth of their daughter that the man she had believed was preparing to build a life with her had accounts that were legally frozen in divorce proceedings and an income that had just ceased to exist. The financial scaffolding of the future she had imagined evaporated. She is raising their daughter, as far as I know, largely independently. I bear her no ill will. We were both lied to. That is not a sisterhood I chose, but it is one I recognize. Patricia, his mother, has not spoken to him since that morning in the hospital. I know this because she told me herself in a brief, composed phone call 6 weeks later, during which she apologized for raising a man capable of this and asked if I was all right. I told her I was. I meant it. Daniel is renting a 1-bedroom apartment and managing a divorce settlement that Eleanor has structured with the thoroughness of an architect and the mercy of a tax auditor. And me. I sleep well. That surprises people. They expect the aftermath of betrayal to be its own kind of wreckage, a secondary disaster that arrives after the primary one. For some people, it is. I understand that. But here is what I know. The moment I stood in that hospital waiting room and handed my husband those papers without raising my voice, without performing my pain for an audience of one, that was not my lowest moment. That was my highest. Silence is not weakness. It is precision. It is the choice to withhold your reaction until your reaction has been converted into something consequential. Every woman who has ever been underestimated, who has been mistaken for too comfortable, too trusting, too absorbed in the life she was building to notice the cracks in its foundation, knows what I mean. We notice. We always notice. We are simply sometimes deciding what to do about it. Never underestimate a quiet woman with a law degree on speed dial and a very good memory for where she left her phone.